So we're going to study Daf Vav, but first we have to begin on Daf Hey Amid Beis. And we're going to count up 4 lines up from the bottom of Hey Amid Beis. The Meimer de Savra Shmuel. And this is a statement of Rav Papa to Abaye. And it's based on the fact that Shmuel goes on record as saying that it's sufficient to say Harei at Mekudeshes, even though he didn't add the word Li. You know the famous story about the Masechet Kiddushin. He said, repeat after me. Harei, and the Chassan said Harei. At. Mekudeshes, Mekudeshes. And then he said, say Li. So he said, say Li. Anyway,
cute. Yeah.
So Lemeimer de Shavar Shmuel.
Can I fix the chair so you can sit on the whole chair? There you go. Much better.
Lemeimer de Shmuel, de Shavar Shmuel, Yadayim Sheidim Ochichos, having Yadayim. So we have our loch of Yadayim, and Yesh Yad L'Kiddushin, but there's Yadayim Ochichos and Yadayim She'enam Ochichos. So, for example, if he says to Leah, Harei Mekudeshes Li, and then he says to Rachel, Va'at, then that's Yadayim Mochichos. But if he says Harei Mekudeshes, and he doesn't add the word Li, the Gemara says that's Yadayim She'eno Mochichos. So it's not absolutely clear. There's still a level of ambiguity. But Shmuel holds Yadayim She'eno Mochichos having Yadayim. And we assume that Shmuel would be consistent and apply that same rule to other areas. For example, if a man says, Hareini Nazir, so that's clearly a language of Kabbalah's Nazirus. What happens if a person says, Ehei, I will be, and a Nazir is walking right in front of him? So we can complete contextually that when he said I will be a hey, he meant to say I'll be a hey Nazir, like this Nazir who's passing by. But Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah in Masechet Nedarim. No, it's actually at the beginning of Masechet Nazir. Ha'omer ahei harei zeh Nazir havina ba dilma ahei b'tainis kamer. Maybe when he says I will be in a tainis, and it's only a lashon kabbalas tainis. Rabbi Yehuda v'Usha Nazir over lefanav. So Rav Papa analyzes this. Taima did Nazir over lefanav. Halav hachilo. In other words, we need an absolutely crystal clear, certain indication that's called Yadayim Mochichos, that he meant to make him to take upon himself Nazirus. And by parallel in Kiddushin, we should require Yadayim Mochichos. So the Gemara answers, Hacha b'maika v'vayaskinon di Omar Li. So Shmuel was not talking about a case where he said Harei Mekudeshes. That would be Yadayim She'enam Mochichos, and Shmuel requires Yadayim Mochichos. So the Gemara answers that Shmuel said that Harei Mekudeshes Li. He actually said the word Li. Ihochi maika mashmalon. What is Shmuel teaching me? Harei Mekudeshes Li is the absolute standard formula for Kiddushin. So the Gemara answers, what's the Kiddush of Shmuel? Hani, and here we start our daf Vav. Hani lishni basroi kamashmal. Enochinami. Shmuel didn't have to tell me that Harei Mekudeshes Li is a valid formulation of Kiddushin. But he was telling us something about Gerushin. If a man gives a get to his wife, and he says Hareat Mishuleches or Hareat Muteres L'chol Adam, he didn't use a complete language of Gerushin. Or, for example, let's say he says Eini Ishech, I'm no longer your husband. Eini Balech, Eini Arusech. would that be a valid gerushin? No, that's not a valid gerushin. So lishni basroi kokomashmalon. He wants to teach you which expressions, which formulations of gerushin are incomplete and therefore invalid. And why is it that Shmuel disqualifies those incomplete languages of gerushin, like Eini Ishech, Eini Baalech, Hachaksiv Kiikach? Because we have an equation between gerushin and Kiddushin, the famous Havaya Liyitzia. Right? The Torah says, V'holcha v'hoisa li'ishachet. That after he's shilcha mi beiso, she gets married. So Hacha Ksiv, with regard to Kiddushin, it says, Ki yikach v'lo she'yikach es atzmo. It doesn't, he doesn't take himself into Kiddushin, but rather, he is Makadish her. With regard to gerushin, it says v'shilcha v'lo she'yishalach es atzmo. By saying Eini Baalech or Eini Ishech, he is basically removing himself from marriage, from the issues. And that's the equivalent of Yishalach es atzmo and Yikach es atzmo in the case of Kiddush. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, Hareat ishti, Hareat arusasi, Hareat knuyoli mekudeshes. Now, this brisa that we're learning gives a whole long list of valid lishonos of Kiddushin, but look at the way the brisa sets up different bavos, different segments. How many languages of Kiddushin do we have? We have all told 6. But look at the way he breaks it up. Number 1, Hareat Ishti. Hareat Arusasi, Hareat Knili, that's 3. And then the Brisa says Mekudeshes. Then another 3. Hare at Shali, Hare at Birshusi, Hare at Skukali, again Mekudeshes. So why did the Brisa split the 6 Lishonos, valid Lishonos of Kiddushin, into 2 segments made up of 3 Lishonos each? The listener Ukula Bachada, why didn't he just list all 6 in one continuous enumeration with the word Mekudeshes at the end of the 6? Why did he divide up into 3 and 3? And if not for the Gemara's answer, if we were working just on our own, we could have said the following, that the first 3 Lishonos are crystal clear. The second 3 Lishonos are what you call Yadayim. And the Brisa therefore wants to separate between clear, unambiguous Lishonos and Yadayim. But the Gemara gives a different answer. And the Gemara says, Tana tlas sham inu v'garsinim. The Tana was teaching at Brisa in the way that he had a transmission when he received these halachos from his Rebbeim. So the way you were makabel halacha, that's the way you formulate it. So he heard it in 2 sections. But again, the Gemara sort of sideswipes the main issue. Well, why did he hear it in 2 different transmissions? There must have been a logical cogency to these 3 and a separate for the other 3. In any event, the Boilu, the Gemara now has a whole bunch of Lishonos that are suffix. And it's very interesting because at the end of Gerushin, the classic case of Safek Kiddushin is Safek Karov Lo, Safek Karov La. But you can have a Safek even in the Lashon of Kiddushin, even if it was Karov La. For example, Miuchedes Limahu. Miuchedes is a language of Yichud. And the Gemara says in Masechet Kiddushin that Yichud hein Yichud hein bia, and therefore when a man is miyached a woman to himself, he's indicating the dimension of Kiddushin Bia. Now we have another suffix, Miu Edisli Mahu. Miu Edisli means you are mine, as Rasi Mahu, referring, as Rashi says here, to the pasuk of Eselo Ezer Kenegdo. Chava is called by the Torah an Ezer for Adam Rishon. So it's a language of Kiddushin. Negdasi Mahu, the Torah says, Esa, you see the fifth line from the top in Rashi, Esa lo ezer kenegdo. So the Torah used the word kenegdo with regard to marriage. Atzurasi mahu. Rashi doesn't tell us. Oh yeah, here it is. I think that Rashi has a slightly different sequence. So Rashi has skurasi before atzurasi. We have it in our text in the reverse. So what's skurasi? Rashi says Loshan vayizgar basa. And what's atzurasi? Loshan atzeres sheteines sefes imi lebayis. And it's based on a pasuk in Tanakh, ki isha atzura lonu. Okay, Rashi's not happy with that, but in any event, Salosi Mau, right? Chava was the tzela, taken from the tzela of Adam Arishon. Tachti Mau, right? And Rashi's going to quote the pasuk by Yiskar Sabasa Tachta. And then we have Tfusasi. Oh, that's a difficult one. Why Tfusasi? Oh, right. In the parsha of a woman who had an extramarital relationship, and she becomes a sota. So it says there in the pasuk, "Vehi lo nitfasa." So
I think you could continue with it back up in the front again.
I don't think so.
Okay.
So the language of Tfusasi is a language of Kiddushin. Lukuchasi, of course, vayikach ki yikach ishisha. So the Gemara says, look, I can't answer any of your questions but one. Showed me a chada desanya homer lukuchasi areisim mekudesim shum shenemar ki yikach ishisha. So in all the other cases, it's going to be a safek Kiddushin. Iboilahu charufasi mahu. We have a parsha of Shivcha Charufa. And Shivcha Charufa is a Shivcha Knanis, but half of her was freed by one of the two partners that own the Shivcha. So she's what you call a Chetzi Shivcha, Chetzi Baskorin, and the Baskorin part is called Charufasi. Tashma Desanya Omer Charufasi Mekudeshes. However, the Gemara is not satisfied with the fact that Charufasi is indicated by the Torah as a Shivcha Charufa. We need to see if down in the trenches, so to speak, the minhag is to use that word Charufasi in the context of marriage. Shekain b'Yehuda korim le'arusa charufa. Frek the Gemara, okay, but the Brisa says Omer Charufasi Mekudeshes. That doesn't mean that only in Yehuda it's operative and valid. The Yehuda v'Ruba di Alma. Hachikama. This is what the Brisa means. Omer Charufasi Mekudeshes shenevar v'hi shivcha nechrefes leish. The Od the Yehuda korim larusa charufa. I don't get it. You just quoted a pasuk, and now you're telling me that in Yehuda that's what they call it. So the Gemara says, "Yehuda v'od likra." I mean, you have to add to the pasuk the fact that in Yehuda they use that term charufasi. Elohachi kom haomer charufasi b'Yehuda mekudeshes. The only location on the face of the earth where charufasi is a valid language of Kiddushin is in Yehuda. Shekem b'Yehuda karu larusa charufa. So it means outside of Yehuda, charufasi would not. Okay, so here we don't know what the next word should be. What's the deal if he says hareach charufasi outside of Yehuda? The simple shot would be that outside of Yehuda would be a Safek Kiddushin, similar to the other languages that we have. Or maybe the Gemara is saying that outside of Yehuda, the language Charufasi does not indicate at all a connection of issues. Even though the Torah uses the word Shivcha Charufa Le'ish, but it could be that the word Charufa means that initially she was designated as a Shivcha, completely as a Shivcha. And therefore Charufasi does not indicate a language of Ishus at all. But in Yehuda, that's where Arus is called Charufa, and therefore it's a language. Now, Mu'edesli, and all the others are a valid language of Kiddushin. And now we get to the famous sugi of Oskim the Oso Inyan. The Gemara feels that Mu'edesli means you're singled out, or Mu'edesli you're designated for me and only for me. These languages are still ambiguous. Is then mina yada maika amarla. In the middle of no paragraph, no discussion, no context, he says to her, Areyat Mu'edesli. She doesn't understand that that's Kiddushin. Now, in Kiddushin, we need both das kone, that's the Baal, and das makne, the Isha's das. If she doesn't know what he means to say to her, and there was no discussion about marriage and no context, then we have no reason to believe that she understood that this is Kiddushin. And maybe she accepted it as a gift. But it has to be Medaber Imaliske Gita V'Kiddusha. They were speaking about who would support whom, which of the two, after they get married, which father would bring in what contribution to the marriage. And then he gave her Kiddushin, and he said to her, Hare at Mu'edesli or Hare at Mu'edesli. The Afa Gavdlo Omar Lo Nami. So the Gemara asks the following question here. If it's Oskim be Oso Inyan, they were Oskim be Iske Gita V'Kiddusha, then he doesn't have to say anything to her. So why do you connect this with Mu'edesli, Mu'edesli, which are ambiguous languages of Kiddushin? This now we learned in the Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Masechet Ma'aser Sheni. Hayomedaber im ishal iske Gita V'Kiddusha, v'nasan lo Gita V'Kiddusha lo piresh. He didn't explain at all. He didn't say anything. He just gave her Kiddushin. Rabbi Yossi Omer Dayo, the Kiddushin is binding, and Rabbi Yehuda Omer Tzarech Lefarish. The Amar Rav Huna Amar Shmuel Alocha Ke Rabbi Yehuda, Ke Rabbi Yossi, excuse me. So we see clearly that the Oskim Bosa Inyan, and they had a discussion about marriage, then he doesn't have to use any declarations, any nuschos and lashonos of Kiddushin. The giving and the receiving of the Kiddushin is itself sufficient to qualify and generate ishus. And the Gemara answers, Amri liola medabri ma'alis kegita b'kiddusha. You'll ask me, so why does this have to do with mu'edesli, miuchedesli? Yoyev laveshosik hachinami. This is the principle, we say kol hamosif goreha. Sometimes you add and you make it worse. This is a perfect example. Had he said nothing and given her the Kiddushin and she accepted the matbea or the tabas, whatever it was, everything would be fine. She's certainly mekudeshes. But instead, Hacha, the Mayaskinon, instead of being silent, when he gave her the kesef, he messed up by saying and here's where we don't understand. And we vacillate. Hani lishni the Kiddushin kamar law. Does he mean a language of Kiddushin or dilma limalacha kamar law? Maybe he was saying to her that you are miuchedesli or muedesli for work. He was just hiring her for work. Where's the Rashi? There's a Rashi on this. Okay, I'm not finding the Rashi. Okay, so in any event, the bottom line of what we're learning here is that Teku, we are in a suffix, we don't know whether he meant limalacha, and therefore, even though it was oskim also inyan, he's indicating to her, you know what? Suffice it if I hire you for work. Now, of course, in the case of Teku, I think we're going to have to require a get. Well, I don't have the ability to check that out right now. Gufa. Rabbi when does Rabbi Yossi say that it's enough that they were oskim also inyan? Shasuki be also inyan. Aval v'chein Amar Rabbi Loza Amar Rabbi Oshia Usha oskim also inyan. Zok Rashi. May inyole insha poskim u'daber Kiddushin mamish v'yimedab midvar macherim dor tzarchei zivugim hayu k'mo. So what happens in a case where they were talking about marriage and getting married, and then they sort of got into a side discussion about how they're going to divide up property? Kitanoi. And this statement of Rabbi Yehuda or Shmuel depends upon a machlokas tanoi, because Rebbe Omer Rushos Kiboso Inyan, but Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Shimon Omer Afal Pisha Enos Kiboso Inyan. So the Gemara says he lav asu Kiboso Inyan Mino Yodamaika Omerlo. If they're not talking about marriage, how would she know? Omar Abaye Me Inyalinya Boso Inyan. There was somewhat of a digression. They were no longer talking head on about marriage. They started speaking, as Rashi says, "Kamasodos yeshlecha." How much money do you have in the bank account? How are you going to support this marriage? And according to the sheet of Rabbi Lozer, Rabbi Shimon, against the previous sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, Omar Shmuel, even though they had this digression, and then he gave her the money, it's a valid Kiddushin. Because even these other topics of digression are related to the marriage. Amar Rav Huna Mishmal Loch Rav Yosef. Amale Rav Yemel Rav Ashi. V'yela Hadi Amar Rav Yehuda Mishmal Kol Sheni Yodea B'Tiv Gittin V'Kiddushin V'Yelo Eseki Moem. So you're telling me that the halacha is like Rav Yosef, and therefore Hayu Oskim Ba'oso Inyan replaces the need for Lashonos Kiddushin. But yet, we have a principle that if you're not an expert in the laws of Kiddushin, you shouldn't get involved with them at all. So what's the Gemara's problem now? Just a second. The Gemara says, how do we gauge someone who knows the law? How do we know? What exam should we give him? What is the basic knowledge? Like, for example, you want to take math second level, you have to pass math first level. So what's the basic level? If you didn't hear this statement about how you oskim boso inyan that we paskin like Rav Yossi, then you know what? Such a person, he's not aware of the halacha of how you oskim boso inyan. Such a person should not get involved in paskening and handing down rulings with regard to Kiddushin. He doesn't know the nature of Kiddushin. He's not an expert in the laws of Kiddushin. And he might allow a woman who was wed to marry someone else, etc., etc. This is very dangerous areas to get involved in. V'chein begerushin. Now we're going to go back to Shmuel about Yadayim She'enim Ochichos. Nosa Lagito V'Yomer, he said to her, Hareat Mishulachas, Hareat Megoreshes, Hareat Muteres Cholod. Okay, that's a Yad HaMochiach, Hareat Megoreshes. And then Shmuel adds a bunch of cases where it's a Yad She'enim Ochiach. Like when he says to her, you're in your own rishus, or any sheikh, any balech. Pshita nasan lagita v'yamaloli ishto harei at baschorim. This is a language that's typical of of freeing a slave woman. And now he wants to use that language as a language of Gittin. And the Gemara says, Lo Amar V'lo Klum. That's not a valid language of Gerush.